What's up, everyone? Normal Christians Podcast. My name is Bo. As always, I reserve the right to get smarter. And in this episode, I want to talk to you about something that bothers me, which shouldn't be a surprise. I've done a few of these where there's something bothering me. But I want to clarify. It's not as much the subject material that I'm about to read that bothers me. Really, it's just some of the assumptions or beliefs that are espoused within this article that I'm about to partially read to you that bother me. And it's because I've heard these sort of things a lot, and I just think that they're baseless in a lot of instances. But certainly, even if there is a basis in some truth in what's being said, I think it's applied wrong, and it just frustrates me in general. But ultimately, I'll land at a different place that I think is important. So two things. One bothering me, and I'll land at a different place, and you'll see what I'm saying. But the article that I read that kind of spurred this whole thing on was called, "I'm Raising My Children Without Religion in a Non-Secular World, and I Regret Nothing." And that's by Alyssa King Peters. And to be clear, again, the subject matter isn't anything that I'm bothered at. I think that a parent should be able to choose however he or she wants to raise their child. In this case, Alyssa should be able to raise her child however she wants. That's fine. That's her prerogative. Certainly, as a pastor, I wish that all people would choose to raise their kid in line with God's word, within the Christian worldview, and more than that, more importantly, to be Christian, to have a relationship with God, and to be changed by Christ's perfect life, his sacrificial death, and his resurrection, where he was raised in power, and having that effect and change our lives. That's ultimately my hope. But at least just in general, people should absolutely get to choose how to raise their children. So this idea of Alyssa raising her kids however she wants, in this case in a secular way, that's not bothersome. There's just some things that she said to me that are bothersome, and I'll get to that. She starts the article saying, "As a child, organized religion was something that, despite my religious mother's best efforts, I was never fully able to get on board with. Even when I tried, I could never get past the concept of a deity who seemed to be completely at peace with rape, child abuse, genocide, and other worldly horrors. There were many years in my childhood that I felt cajoled into believing a very serious set of ideas that was just never going to be for me. As a result, I always knew that if I ever had children of my own, that I wanted to raise them in a secular manner." So that's how she starts. She just says, look, I grew up in a religious home. I was exposed to this, but it didn't jive with me. It wasn't for me in a lot of ways. So she made that commitment. If I ever have kids, they'll be raised in a secular home, in which she did have kids. She has 2 children, and, 2 kids, I believe, from the article. And so that's what she's doing. She's raising them in a secular manner. But even from the start, I begin to see a little bit of some kind of stuff here where she starts to talk about a deity, a God, who's completely at peace with things, as she said, rape, child abuse, genocide, and other worldly horrors. So all that signals to me is that she was brought up in a religious home, but she was brought up, I guess I should say I don't know this, but it would be my belief from at least my experience dealing with people who have this objection, which, side note, is a completely fair objection in a lot of ways. Just want to make sure that's clear. She's definitely not out of line for pointing out this reality, because it is something that needs to be dealt with. But what it signals to me is that she was probably in a religious home where everything was just accepted, in the sense of the religion was just accepted, and it wasn't really talked about, and there wasn't much discussion or thought about other things or bigger topics. Specifically, as you could see, she clearly wasn't exposed to answers regarding what does God think about these subjects, and why isn't he intervening, and what does this mean about God, and some of the bigger truths that are out there dealing with Christianity, dealing with these subjects. And there are answers out there. There are good answers. I've obviously studied a lot of that. But this just signals that Okay, she was probably in a religious household where there wasn't an openness to questioning, or at least maybe even a church where they didn't go over some of this stuff. Now, this is all complete assumption, but for her to lead very quickly off with that and to say, well, this reality didn't gel with me and it just didn't work, seems to say, well, she was in a religious household, but there probably wasn't a lot of openness to questions or to thinking things through or being open and honest about concerns. I don't know if that's the case, but that seems to be the case. Regardless, she chooses to have her kids grow up in a secular household. And she goes on, as an agnostic mother of 2 children, including one very curious toddler, raising children without religion is sometimes more challenging than I could have imagined. For instance, she says, death is not surprisingly one of the most challenging subjects to have to tackle as an agnostic. Absolutely makes sense. If you are agnostic, atheist, and you believe that really this life is all there is, death is a very difficult subject. There's no hope for whatever comes next, or a hope that we will see other people again. And she kind of addressed this. There's kind of even framed it, not exactly, but in a way that there's not this kind of cheery, almost roundabout way of getting around the difficulty of death by saying we will see these people again, or she even talked about her dog. And that's fine. I get that in one aspect. And certainly as an agnostic, these are the things that she has to deal with. This is a result of her worldview compared to a Christian worldview says there's hope after death. There's something beyond this life in a lot of ways. And then she goes on to say that she doesn't even mind that some of her friends are religious, despite the fact that she's trying to bring up her kids in a secular environment. As a matter of fact, she says, the goal is always the same, talking about how her I said Christian, but her religious friends and their goal is in how they raise their kids is ultimately the same. To teach our children to be open-minded and mindful of the fact that all belief systems are just different ways of making sense of the same concepts, our world, and the things in it. So with that little paragraph, we begin to see a little bit more about some of the baseline assumptions that she holds. Now, what she said there isn't completely wrong. I don't care who you are, you should be raising your child trying to raise them to be kind, to be loving, to be accepting of other people and differences. Doesn't mean we can't hold on to beliefs in our worldviews, as I'm going to talk about, but we should always be loving and open to people. That's absolutely true. But she begins to say that all belief systems are just ways of making sense of the same concepts, our world and the things in it. And that's a decent way of getting at a definition of a worldview, which is kind of what I mentioned a couple times, but it's important. All of us, all human beings, whoever you are listening, wherever you're from, whatever your life story is, whatever all this stuff is, we all have worldviews. And a worldview definition is a decent way that she put forward. She says it's different ways of making sense of the same concepts of world and the things in it. Yeah, that's a worldview. A worldview's simplest way to think about it is just a way of viewing the world. And so she's hitting at a reality that our differences, our belief systems, are worldviews. And that's true. And that's something that I think is so important. And at least she's honest at this part about that. I don't care whether you are an agnostic, an atheist, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Muslim, whatever, Jewish, whatever your belief system is, whether you say you have no belief system or a belief system, you have a worldview. You have a way of looking at the world and everything in it. And your worldview is a lens through which you view life, what's happening around you, what's going to happen to you, what ultimate reality is, all those things, they all fall under the umbrella of a worldview. Simply put, again, it's how we view the world. It's how we view reality. And so one thing that bothers me a lot is that atheist and agnostic friends and people, or just people in general, not just my friends, but there's this sense that they don't have a belief system. They're open, right? They're science people, or they are just open-minded people, but they don't have a rigid belief system like us religious people do. But I think that that's so disingenuous, because here's the reality. All of us have a worldview, and a religion is a worldview in a different way. Now, of course, there's differences, but just in general, broad speaking here, a religion is just a way of viewing the world in a specific way. Just like saying that you don't have a worldview don't have a belief system is a worldview. Atheism and agnosticism, in a lot of senses, have aspects that form worldviews, or just in general worldview. So I just go on that little tangent to say this is important. Too often, people convince themselves, oh, well, I'm the open-minded person. I'm the one who isn't rigid in this and that. When it's just not the case. And I guess it depends all on definitions. But even if you are so open-minded, you're still coming with a worldview that has a set of beliefs behind it. Your beliefs about how you're viewing the world in reality. That's just unavoidable. We all have a worldview. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's important, and we all need to know we have a worldview and be honest about it, that it has its own beliefs and its own rigidness in different ways. But she really begins... the frustrating part is she really begins to say something in a few paragraphs down where I think this is the main problem. She says, I acknowledge that raising godless children doesn't guarantee that they won't pursue some kind of faith on their own at some point. If this happens to be the outcome, I'm comfortable with this and will not view it as any kind of failure of my parenting. Why would it be a failure of your parenting? Well, that's a different story. In the meantime, here's an important part. I'm happy to guide my daughters using science and critical thinking to explore the world on their own terms. If religion is a path one or both of them choose to take, I want that to be a choice for them rather than a predetermined indoctrination. And so right here is the heart of my, truly the heart of my issue. She says, I'm happy to guide my daughters using science and critical thinking to explore the world on their own and in their own terms. Well, guess what? First off, I'm happy to do that. I don't have kids, but I want them to use critical thinking and be open to science. She's making a broad assumption about religion and the religious community. And this is why I said earlier, my assumption was she was in a household that didn't allow exploration or questioning and was probably extremely fundamentalist in some ways. Not to bash fundamentalism, but some aspects of fundamentalism, at least in regard to how some people approach fundamentalism, is not very open to questioning and pursuit of knowledge. And it doesn't have to be fundamentalism. It could be all kinds of things. So sorry to pick on fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is completely okay, in my opinion, depending on what that actually looks like. But I just hate that she puts this false dichotomy between religion and apparently science and critical thinking, because she's contrasting that, hey, they might become religious, but until that's the case, I'm going to raise them in this manner of science and critical thinking. And I just think that's such a bummer. That's such a bummer. It's another kind of baseless assumption about the Christian or religious worldview, compared to the atheist and agnostic worldview, which is, again, the open one, the science one, the critical thinking one. And I just, that stuff bothers me, because I love science. I love following science and keeping up with it. And I'm blown away about different realities. I was looking at some stuff about black holes the other day, and the continuing studies that are going on with black holes and what that's teaching us about our universe. I love that sort of stuff. It's incredible. And I have no problem fitting in science with my worldview, which is Christianity. Sure, there's some things that, there's some tough answers and there's some different aspects that need to be fit together. I get that. And that won't be dealt with in this episode. But I truly believe the God of the universe, as I believe him, the Christian God, God Almighty, the Creator God, he has no problem with us looking at the world, studying the world and his creation and the universe and all that, because he's the one who created it. He created it good. As a matter of fact, in Job, when he's responding to Job, he responds by telling him, look around, Job, where were you when I did all these things in creation, when I hung the stars? Where were you when I did all this? He's pointing to his own creation. Paul talks about how creation testifies in a lot of ways about God. We can know something about God from his creation. So I think it's ridiculous when atheists and agnostics have this sort of belief that they are the people of science. They are the people of critical thinking. And I didn't even get into critical thinking, but I think that everyone should raise their kids to think critically about the world and even about their religion and how they're being raised. That should be done across the board. So I hate that apparently she did not have that. But now this is truly something that bothers me, this assumption that gets tied that we're not science people and we're not critical thinking people. And there's certainly some religious people who aren't. So can't say it's all people, but I don't think there's anything wrong with Christianity or religion in general with these two things. But another thing that bothers me, she says, I want that choice to be theirs, whether it be religion or not, rather than a predetermined indoctrination. And this truly is the biggest bothering aspect of me, or the thing that bothers me the most, because I've heard this so much. I don't want my kid to go to this religious thing or that religious thing or this Christian thing, or I don't want them to be brought up with Christian principles or Christian worldview in this sort of way, simply because I don't want them to be indoctrinated. Or I even heard some lady give a debate talking about how bringing up your kid in Christian ways is pure indoctrination. And it just drives me nuts. Because, again, this gets back to the idea that people who are secular or who are humanists or who are agnostic and atheist, that they, in a way, don't have a worldview, or they have this superior worldview, and so they aren't indoctrinating their children through how they're raising them. And I get this all gets back to the definition of indoctrination, but everyone, in every sense, has a worldview, and when you raise your child or expose them to, you are indoctrinating them in some way. You are saying that this is how reality works, or this is how it should work. And it's indoctrination, and at least in some sense. Again, someone may disagree with me on the definition. And so this is what bothers me. Oh, it's only religious people who do the indoctrination. And I just want to say, get out of here. That's ridiculous. Indoctrination happens across the board, especially nowadays in this country. Political indoctrination is so bad. It's so bad. Politics has become such a religion in this country. Quote unquote. It's not exactly a religion, but it's taken on a lot of religious aspects. I'll do an episode on that one day. And so kids get indoctrinated into this political sphere. So you're indoctrinating your kids some way, in some form. So this sense that, oh, I don't want them to get this predetermined indoctrination. Get out of here. Get off of the high horse that so many agnostics and atheists have. It's just ridiculous, and it bothers me. Oh, we are the people who aren't going to indoctrinate our kids. No, you're indoctrinating your kid. You're indoctrinating them in some sort of way. So anyway, that's my kind of issues with it. But she ends this way. To me, one of the greatest gifts I can give my child is a chance to define their world in a way that makes sense to them, rather than have their world already defined for them, building off the indoctrination thing. And this is truly where I think the heart of the issue and the problem comes into it. It's this idea that we can define the world our way. And I think it's so ironic that she would say this after saying that she wants to raise her children using science and critical thinking, guide them in that way. But then at the same time saying that they can define the world in their way. That's not how this works. We don't get to define the world how we want. Really, critical thinking should lead us to the search of truth and the search of answering truth, finding answers to reality. So seeking out truth, what is the truth behind these questions that we have, or this reality that we're seeing? That is what we should be. We should be in the process on the search of truth and promoting that with people, including our kids. So I think it's ironic that she says, I want them to be able to define reality in a way that makes sense to them, define their world in that way instead of having it already defined for them. Well, first off, as I said, you're already defining things for them in a lot of senses. But even if you are open, you're still putting them in this, you're still indoctrinating them, you're still giving them a worldview that says, guess what, that they can define the world their own way. That's a worldview. That's an indoctrination in a sense. Ugh. It just bothers me because it's like the superiority of, oh, I'm not doing what you religious people do. Yet you are, just in a different way. And your indoctrination and your worldview says, guess what, you can make whatever you want out of the world. Okay. That's fine. You could choose to do that. That's your choice as a human being raising kids. But my worldview And I believe a actual real worldview says that the world is a specific way. The world operates a specific way, and there is a truth to be had in this world and in reality. So I want to seek it out. I want to think critically about my beliefs and my assumptions and see how that fits with reality and the truth that I'm seeing, and then again put my beliefs against truth and reality and see if they hold up. And I believe the Christian worldview certainly does across the board. And so this idea, they'll just define it however they want. I think it's misguided. I think it's wrong. And I think it's setting their kids up for failure, honestly, in a lot of ways. A lot of what we're seeing now is people who are just trying to redefine reality however they want. And we're not in a good place because of that, societally wise and cultural wise, in a bunch of aspects. Because we keep trying to redefine reality or redefine truth instead of seeking out truth and living according to that reality. And I believe as we dig deeper into truth, actually the Christian worldview, the Christian religion, gives us the best answer for the reality we see, whether it be scientifically, whether it be morally, whether it be spiritually, whether it be whatever it is. If you dig down enough, Christianity, I believe, truly is the answer as I've thought through it. So I've given you some of my frustrations. It's these views that so many people have of, well, we're the open-minded side when we're not Christians or religious. We're the party, or not the party, we are the people of science and critical thinking. And we ultimately, and this is kind of where it leads in some sense, we ultimately want to be able to be people who define this world or make sense of it in our own sort of way, rather than having it defined for us. And I think it's problematic across the board. And hopefully, we aren't doing this as Christians. And here's what I mean. As Christians, whether you have kids or don't have kids, in general, you need to know what you believe and why you believe it. This is important, right? We need to know and have on the forefront, be able to defend our faith. Well, that's actually the second thing. But we need to know what we believe and why we believe it. The hope and the incredible promises that we have and be able to live it out. Because this as the world in a lot of ways is getting redefined and reality is trying to be said it's this way instead of that way, and truth is being pushed aside and people are trying to monopolize science and critical thinking, you better be strong in your beliefs. You better know what you believe, or else you'll be tested and you'll falter, which gets to the second thing that I think we need to do is, as Scripture says, we need to be able to have a defense for the hope that we have, a defense for our faith. Now, part of this defense isn't being people who aren't for critical thinking or for pushback on our beliefs. That's part of having a defense. Again, I think that this woman, as a child, was exposed to a belief system, probably Christianity, but religion in general, that wasn't open to questioning or to probing or to critical thinking these different aspects of faith and belief. And so what happened was she threw the baby out with the bathwater. And that can happen so easily when we do not have a good defense for our faith. It doesn't mean you have to go take apologetics courses or know everything, but you need to be able to think through some of the difficult subjects and not just say, well, I'm a Christian and thus the Bible, tells me so. And by the way, I shouldn't have said that because we absolutely hang our hats on the Bible. That is God's word. But what I meant by that is I was taught in Sunday school a simple Bible lesson, and because of that, I've now formed this whole worldview with no real backing, no real foundation to that with answers to the world. And I think that's dangerous. Yes, our foundation is the Bible. That is the truth, God's word. We don't bend on that. That's how we view the world. That's our lens in so many ways. But what we do is we take the truths of the Bible and we see how is it applied to the world that we're experiencing. What does this mean when she talks about the God of the universe looking at rape and all these bad things? What does our Bible, what does our worldview have to say? Science is a big one. Science, people confound naturalism and just science in general. Science is just a process of discovery in a lot of ways. But naturalism likes to say X, Y, Z. So how do we take naturalism on and say, well, okay, I also believe science, and here's how my worldview, and here's the answers that I have for some of these questions. Again, We don't have to have them all, but can we at least have a foundational defense of our faith? Ready to give a defense of the hope we have, as Scripture says. Because what happens is, too often, as this woman has kind of hinted at, Christians and other religious people have just hung their hat on, well, I don't have an answer and you shouldn't question and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, oh, come on, man. Come on. What are you doing? What are you doing here? We need to have a defense. And especially if you're a parent, you need to be able to have tough conversations with your kids across the board about societal issues or about things that are going on or tough questions or just questions that they have. And maybe you don't have all the answers, but say, I don't know. That's okay. To say, look, I don't know. Let's find out together. Let me search it out. Let me go to my church. Hopefully you're in a church that can give you answers and a pastor who can help walk you through. And then sometimes you might just say, look, I don't have all the answers, but this is what we believe. Again, you're giving a defense. But be open to questioning. It's one thing I never understood. If you are a Christian and you're not open to questioning or thinking critically through different things, you're A, setting yourself up for failure. B, people who may have honest questions and are coming to you for answers, and you seem so rigid and don't have any sort of defense, what that's going to do is that's going to give them skepticism and maybe even push them away. And then 3, or C, especially if you're a parent, what you're going to do is you're going to be setting your kid up for failure. You're not going to have taught them how to explore and think through difficult issues through a Christian worldview and through a Christian lens. And so eventually they'll be hit between the eyes with an issue and they won't be equipped. They won't have a defense or the ability to think through and have a defense in some way. And so they might end up like this lady did. And I think the third thing we need to do is always be humble. This lady, I'm sure she's a nice lady, but she comes across as pretty pompous, pretty prideful in her stance about, well, I'll teach my kids science or the critical thinking. I don't want them to be indoctrinated. It's like, come on, all right, stop it. Get off your high horse. Realize you have your own worldview. And so Christians, we can never be this way. We can never sit and first off, we shouldn't judge people for choosing to raise their kids how we want. Clearly, we want to try to demonstrate. That's why I started first, that we need to know what we believe and live it out. Let it truly be lived out. So we want to certainly try to reach people with the gospel because it's the greatest thing that ever happened to us, and it will be the greatest thing that will ever happen to them. But we're not going to judge people. We're going to love them, and we're going to keep loving them. And we're not going to say, how dare you do X, Y, Z? Which might just be completely in line with their worldview. Instead, my worldview, blah, 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 blah. No, be humble. If you have people who believe differently than you, okay, talk to them. Just be a loving neighbor or a loving friend or a loving parent or a loving grandparent. And just talk and love. And through that conversation and that openness and that kindness, that's where you'll be able to share truth, share different parts of your reality if you have a defense. And ultimately, if you're humble and you have a defense and you know what you believe and you're living it out, you'll be able to get times like whenever she says, when agnostics or atheists run into the death issue, or honestly the hopelessness that comes through just a naturalistic worldview, you'll be able to have a defense and an answer that explains the hope that you have and what God has done for you. And you never know what that will be able to do. So that's what I've got for this episode. It's first off my frustration that so many people just think that they don't have some sort of worldview, when in reality they do. And they look down on religion and Christianity as a result, and I hate that. And I certainly hate this idea that, atheism and agnosticism and all that, secularism, humanism, they're the ones with science and critical thinking. Ugh, all that stuff bothers me. And that, only Christians and religious people are indoctrinating. Get out of here. Not to mention, she mentioned all the bad things and how could God sit back and do it. And it's completely fair. But I always say that, agnostics and atheism, it's like, yeah, you just have to look at the 20th century and how good a lack of religion was in places like Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and Mao's China, and such great places boy, without a good Christian worldview or religious worldview or foundation. There were some pretty hard and horrendous things happening there. But anyway, I'm not going to get into all that because other people may be like, well, what is this and that? Nah, we're not going to go down that sense. So really it comes down to, as Christians, man, know what you believe. Don't just, this is what I say all the time, be open to questioning. If you've never thought through your faith, man, really think through it. Why do you believe what you believe? Did you just get handed down to you? Man, think it through. Think through all the aspects of your faith and your worldview. And hopefully come to an answer that leads you to, yeah, okay, I believe in this more than this was just handed to me. And then have a defense for that faith. Have a defense for the hope that you have. And always be humble. Man, always be humble when talking to people. Regardless of what they're saying against you, man, that humility, that love, that kindness is going to be the difference. A lot of times it will never be good arguments, though it will sometimes. It won't be good arguments. It'll be love. It'll be kindness. It'll be, that hope that we live with, that eventually someone will ask, well, how can you continue to be loving? Or, hey, how can you continue to have joy in this situation? Or, why aren't you sad? And we explain the hope. We explain our reality, and that really gets through. So anyway, that's my thoughts. Some of the stuff that bothers me, and I just think it's so prevalent that I just really needed to address it in some way. It was a little off the cuff, so didn't have it quite all together like I should have, but I just read it and I thought, nope, we recording an ep, right? We are recording an episode on this nonsense. Anyway, having fun with it, but thanks again for listening, however you're listening. Man, and before I go, 3515, and I'll see you again next time.